The purpose of the Global CFO Council is to provide an educational and networking forum for senior financial executives in order to share best practices, discuss current financial issues, and to learn about current topics related to the performance of their jobs.
Becky is an HR executive and director at Landrum HR. Is that true?
That is true.
Undergraduate in business management and HR from the University of West Florida. Is that correct?
That is correct.
I think you also went to Pensacola Christian College. Is that correct?
I did. I only lasted 2 years though.
And you are like a certified everything HR related. I'm not reading it all. It's a lot. It's a lot of initials next to your name. Very impressive. I think you were, this is where the thinks. I think you were originally from San Francisco Bay Area.
How are you figuring all this out?
Now living
Yes.
in Florida. Super volunteer in the community, civic organizations, community volunteer at your church, and I think a missions team leader. Is that correct?
Yes. I'm a little concerned, like you might be working for the FBI or something.
Yeah, everybody.
Yes, we did mission work over in Romania for years.
Yeah, everybody thinks that, and it's partially true. Becky, is this...
Oh, dear Lord.
I think this is your high school senior picture, honestly. Is this you?
Yes, that is actually a picture from when I first worked for Mr. Landrum, who founded our company. I was like 19.
Well, it's a great picture, and I now yield the floor back to you. I'm going to give you the presenter roles so you can share. I'm going to mute myself, but very excited for the content that is in the presentation. And I'll talk to you about halfway through and pitch you whatever questions we have from the crowd.
All right, very good. Can everyone see my screen? All right, great. Well, thank you guys for having me. I hope everyone can hear me well. That wasn't nearly as painful as I thought it was going to be, Robert. And I did, say a moment of prayer yesterday when I found out you were going to do that. And thank the Lord Jesus that there was no internet when I was very young. So, but you did find out a whole lot more than I anticipated. So good for you. So I work for Landrum HR and HRQ, which is a business line that Landrum HR holds. We are a national firm. National HR consulting firm. I love what I do. I've been doing it for over 25 years. And it's because it's always changing, right? And it has never changed so much as it has in the last year and a half. And I know that you guys have had that ride just along with us. It seems like every time we turn around, there's some new CDC guidance, there's some new regulation like the FFCRA or the CARES Act, or we're navigating PPP loans, new tax credits. There's more executive orders coming out fast and furious. So it's kind of a unique time to be in business. It's a challenging time, and it's a time when both our businesses are in crisis, and then we're also having to kind of negotiate all these new things. So my job today is really to take you through what's happened this year when it comes to legislative changes. And that's kind of a tall order, so we're not going to be able to go through everything, but I'm going to hit the highlights for you, and maybe if it's something that's near and dear to your business or your industry, you can dive a little deeper from here. So the bulk of what we've seen this year is really wrapped in an executive order. And if you're like me, when I grew up, my mom would stick me in front of the TV on Saturday mornings with a bowl of Cheerios, and I would listen and watch Schoolhouse Rock. And we would all learn how to take a bill through Capitol Hill. And some of you can thank me later today when that song is replaying in your mind. But we really didn't learn about executive orders, did we? And if you're like me, I came to adulthood and really knew very little about executive orders, but they have a huge impact on our business and on our lives as Americans. So we're kind of going to go back to the basics just so that we're all starting from the same spot. And we're going to talk about executive orders for a minute. So what are they? Basically, this is how a president gets around the legislative and judicial branches. So they have the ability to issue an executive order to a federal agency. So it could be the Department of Homeland Security. It could be the Department of Labor. It could be a State Department. And their executive orders are usually single subject matters. So typically when we saw that bill go through Capitol Hill, we saw a lot of pork with it. We saw a lot of extras from special interest groups. That is not the case with an executive order. An executive order is going to be pretty short, usually less than 10 pages. It's single subject matter. And in the strictest of senses, it could be effective immediately. Typically, that's not the case, but it has the ability to be effective immediately. And that's because a lot of times executive orders are used in moments of crisis. We might be at war, we might be dealing with a national crisis, and we need to kind of get through what would typically take months or years through Congress very quickly. So a president can amend or retract their own executive order. They can do this at any time. They can also reverse the executive orders of previous presidents, which is really important. And so it's critical, right, for critical times. It can also be a little unnerving as a citizen that you have one person that is really stroking a pen and telling millions of Americans what they can and cannot do. This is not great to stabilize a nation, to be very honest, simply because it can go back and forth so much. So there was just as a good example, a Mexico policy that the Reagan administration penned an executive order for. Well, here comes the Clinton administration. What did they do? They reversed it. And then George W. reinstated it. And then Obama reversed it. And then Trump reinstated it. So you can see how it almost feels like a ping pong match and can be pretty destabilizing in the areas of those executive orders. So it's not ideal. It really was originally intended for moments of crisis. So no part of the executive order can ever be unconstitutional. So if an executive order dies, it typically dies by judicial review. Or it could die from the pen of a future president. So even though executive orders aren't specifically mentioned in the Constitution, they have been used by every single president since our very first president, George Washington. So for those of you who are concerned about the fact that it isn't in the Constitution, well, there was George Washington. He was pretty close to that. So you know, he was using it and he used it just a little bit, only 8 times. And, you know, the frequency really does depend on the president and it depends on the time of that presidency. So FDR holds the title for the most executive orders, but he was also the president that took us through the Great Depression. So this was really, when you look at the New Deal, this was a string of executive orders that he issued. The other factor with FDR is he was the only president that had 12 years of service as president, as he came in before term limits were established. So we have executive orders that have done really wonderful things. The most famous being the Emancipation Proclamation from President Lincoln, freeing all the enslaved African Americans in the U.S. So we've had some that have done amazing things, but like I said, they have to be constitutional. So for instance, President Truman, if you remember your history, he actually wanted to have the government take over the steel plants and operate them. Well, the Supreme Court stepped in and said, no, you can't do that. That's unconstitutional. So this is just a really unique thing that we have at the president's disposal. It's something that we should all as Americans understand, and definitely as business leaders, we should understand them. Essentially, the presidents have historically used executive orders to circumvent congressional control. George W. did this after 9/11. If you remember, he wanted to have greater aggressive government surveillance programs, and so he used executive orders for that. President Obama used them for immigration reform that wasn't going as quickly as he wanted it to. So some fear that there's an increased threat to that long-standing checks and balances that we all learned about, where Congress makes the laws, the court interprets the laws, and the president and executive branch enforce the law. But essentially, an executive order is one person making a decision for hundreds of millions of Americans without input from Congress, without input from state legislatures, or even courts. So they're a great way to short circuit the constitutional process, but really a terrible way for lasting change within the US. So where does Biden stand on executive orders? Well, he came out with a fury. We'll talk about some of his executive orders today, and you'll notice a lot of them were on Inauguration Day. And so if you look at his time, this graph in front of you is as of April the 8th. He had already issued 12 more executive orders than Trump had at that same period of time. Now, some say that's because Trump did not have a full team fully engaged by election day, whereas Biden already had his team fully engaged. They were already putting proposed executive orders on his desk on election day, so that when he made it to Inauguration Day, he had just a string of executive orders there. So many believe that if Biden keeps this up, that he is going to be the highest president for executive orders that we've seen in the recent past. So you can see here at a glance what initiatives are really important to the Biden administration by way of legislative changes and executive orders. And of course, at the forefront, which it's on the top of mind for everyone, is the pandemic and the coronavirus. You can also see that immigration is a big deal, as well as areas of equity. That seems to be really where this administration is placing their focus. So here are some of the executive orders that we've had this year related to employment. We'll go over these today. The first one actually was signed on Inauguration Day. The order created two new positions. One was the position of coordinator of the COVID-19 response and counselor to the president. The other position was that of deputy coordinator of the COVID-19 response within the executive office of the president. Now, since these roles directly influence the norms established for companies to follow in the aftermath of the epidemic, they're important to us, right? As employers, they're important to us. These positions have a lot of power. We'll undoubtedly see more and more precise recommendations from them on PPE, security within the company, policies and procedures that the companies will be asked to comply with, and that kind of thing, as we become more and more open as a society post-pandemic. So what does the nation look like right now as far as vaccinations go? Well, as of last month, August, this is what we look like. So 60% of our population has had at least one dose of the vaccine. And we're holding at about 51% that have had the full vaccination process. So we're making headway, but we still have a ways to go. And then as far as states go, there are some states that are lagging, and those states are here on your screen in a colored version. South Carolina has only about 44% of its population fully vaccinated. So you can see the Southeast really are kind of lagging behind the rest of the country as far as vaccinations go. Now, when you look at vaccinations by age, you can see that there is quite a difference in our younger group of 20s and 30s versus our older group of the 60s and 70s. And, you know, there's probably not one singular reason for this, right? Part of it is we offered the vaccine to them first, right? When we first started rolling this out, those of us who had not yet made it to that mark weren't offered the vaccine. Another thing that's good to note and kind of keep in mind, especially when you're dealing with different ages within employment, is this older generation has already been through mass vaccination campaigns in their past. Smallpox is a great example of that. So they've gone through this. This isn't nearly as scary for them because they've been there, done that. Whereas the younger generation, this is really their first, meet and greet with a vaccination campaign. And then probably another issue is just the age that they're at, right? So they may not be as worried about long-term complications. They're certainly not worried about things like fertility and things like that, other issues that may come from the vaccine itself. So really quite a difference in the levels of vaccination. Over time, we expect them to kind of meet in the middle. So another executive order that was signed on Inauguration Day was Order 13991. It requires masks and it requires physical distancing in federal buildings and lands. So I know we have some federal contractors on the call today. This does apply to you as well. So you'll need to know this executive order well. I did find it interesting with this executive order that there was no end date. Not every executive order has an end date, but an order like this, I would have expected it. So there's no end date. What can happen is if it's no longer needed, President Biden can retract the executive order, or a future president can reverse the order. But right now, this goes on in perpetuity. So if you're a federal contractor, you need to know this executive order well. Now, Executive Order 14,000, it directs both the Department of Education and Health and Human Services to provide guidance for safely reopening and operating schools. It also talks about, child care centers, institutions of higher education. So basically, the point behind this executive order was in 2020, we found out that kids do not do well not being in an in-person setting for their education. And so the aim behind this is to make sure that we're giving them every ability to have a high quality level of education in person. So if you are a CFO of any kind of a educational institution, you'll want to get to know this executive order well. Some of the things that this executive order does, it creates a clearinghouse of best practices for schools that they can access to see what other schools are doing, what other parts of the country are doing. It also has designated a person, a civil rights secretary, to report any disparate impacts because of the pandemic. So we have really ping-ponged between two major protected classes throughout the pandemic as being the most impacted negatively. One is African Americans and the other is our Latino group. So at different times, different ones have been impacted greatly to a negative extent. So the tracking of that is very important because obviously we don't want to see that continue to happen. This also offers guidance for contact tracing, cleaning, masking, proper ventilation, all of those things for schools. And one of the other things it did that I really liked about this order was it encouraged the Federal Trade Commission, the FTC, to increase connectivity options for students who lack reliable home broadband. And this is for those instances where for some reason, maybe it's a hotbed of COVID, they've had to close the school system down, but it gives them that ability so that we can keep that education level going and moving forward. All right, in August, President Biden directed the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services to develop emergency regulations for nursing homes. And essentially what this did was it said, hey, if you're a nursing home, if you still want to get your Medicare and Medicaid funding, then all of your employees need to be vaccinated. Well, that's huge for nursing homes. I don't know if we have anyone here that operates in a nursing home or a facility like that, but we have 15,000 nursing homes across the country that are affected by this. And that's about 1.3 million workers represented. So that's an enormous amount. And really, this is Biden's aim to go after, a critical sector that he thought was highly vulnerable. Now, this came out in August. At that time, they told us that they felt like it should be implemented by the beginning of September, but we're actually still waiting on them to issue the rule to codify this. So we're still waiting. This could come out today. It really should have already been out by now. So we'll see how this plays out, but this will be important if you are in this industry to stay abreast of. Now, in July, the Department of Justice issued an opinion that all of us were waiting on, which was to make it crystal clear that employers do have a right to mandate vaccination as a requirement of a job. So they made that crystal clear for everyone. And the reality is that a lot of major companies have taken the DOJ up on that. Pretty sizable companies, in fact. Of course, all of our armed forces are doing it. but they're a little different, right, than your typical company. We have seen Delta Airlines is now charging an additional $200 for anyone who is not vaccinated for their benefits package. And although that sounds a little severe and harsh, this is not something that has not been done over time. Many of you have probably seen where a benefits package is more expensive if you have nicotine in your system. This is not unlike that. It's just that we haven't seen it with vaccinations in the past. Now, Deloitte US is requiring 113,000 of their employees to be vaccinated if they're going to enter a facility. And they actually tied that vaccination mandate to 7 weeks after the Pfizer vaccine was approved with FDA approval. Now, California as a state is actually requiring all their teachers and anyone who works in school staff to either be vaccinated or to be tested once a week. And they've been doing that for some time. But then Microsoft, Microsoft always, in my opinion, likes to push the envelope, and they're doing the same thing here. They've taken it a step further. And Microsoft is actually requiring proof of vaccination, not just by their employees, but also by their vendors and anyone that enters their buildings. So that's one of the more extreme circumstances out there that I've heard of. And then, of course, we have companies out there that are doing a hybrid. You might be doing a hybrid where those that are fully remote are not being asked to vaccinate or to show proof of vaccination, but those that are working physically together in a building may have to. Cisco is a great example of that. And then we're also seeing that this is starting to awaken our unions. So we have some really large companies that have large unions attached to them and multiple unions attached to them. For instance, Walt Disney Company. They have required all of their non-union employees to be vaccinated, but are not requiring that of their unionized employees. If you think about it, Walt Disney Company has an awful lot of unions attached to them. So they're not just dealing with one particular service union. They have all types of unions. So that's really a big deal. And we're seeing some other companies that have some union factors in negotiations with unions. But this is starting to wake kind of a sleeping giant that we've had. And so they're really starting to get very active now. And I think that we'll continue to see that for some time. All right. Do we have any questions that have come in so far, Robert?
We do. We have a bunch. So I'm going to hit you rapid fire. First question is, with these executive orders, any idea about the length that they'll stay in effect? That think they'll be the duration of the president's term or something different?
So unless an executive order has a date that it ends, which isn't common, but it does happen, it goes on in perpetuity. So the only way that an executive order goes away is from a current president retracting their own order or a future president reversing that order.
Question number 2, on the map chart a few slides ago, it identified the vaccinated percentages. Do you know if those were, is that a percent of the total population or of the eligible population? Because 20% of the population isn't eligible because they're under the age of 16.
Yes, I believe that is eligible.
And do you know, this is selfish, this is my question, Executive Order 13991 around government contractors. Is the rule for government contractors that they have to be vaccinated if they're in a government building? Or do I have to, I'm a government contractor with buildings all over the United States. Do my buildings, does everybody there have to be vaccinated? What was the rule around government contractors in 13991?
I'd have to dig into that a little deeper, but I'm pretty sure that you're all going to be required to be vaccinated, regardless of whether you're in a federal building. I think that is going to be a part of your contracts moving forward, although they may not be a part of the contracts as they exist today. I will remind you, though, that we still have some things that supersede this. So the Americans with Disabilities Act is still in full force. So if you have an employee that comes to you and says, I have other issues physically and I am not able to get the vaccine, or it would cause me further issue to do so, then you need to take them through that ADA interactive process. If you have an employee that comes to you and says, for religious reasons, I have a sincerely held belief that I should not be taking this vaccine, then this does not supersede the religious protection under Title VII of the Civil Rights Act. So you're going to need to make sure that as an employer, even as a federal contractor, that you understand those processes. This is a great time to review those laws, and to make sure you have an internal process that's really smooth for that, because those things will never be superseded.
Becky, that leads to the next question. Is a perfect combination with that comment, is if you have somebody come to you with one of those type conversations under the advisement of a doctor or a religious issue, and you have different rules for remote versus in person, could this be cause for making a reasonable accommodation for an employee and allow them to work, say, remote that you normally wouldn't because you've set up rules that are different for remote versus in person?
Absolutely. If that job can be done at home, then that is considered a reasonable accommodation. So what I would encourage you to do is to sit down with your leadership of your organization and make sure that you have a really good ADA interactive process. And what I mean by that is that you're taking everyone through the same steps, so that it's not just someone's come to me because they kind of really want to work from home and they're saying this. It's that I'm actually having an interactive process between that employee specialist. That employee specialist has given me multiple options I can take to accommodate this. And then I'm picking the one that I think is best for the employer to start with. It's easy sometimes for these simpler ones to jump straight to an end result. But I would encourage you to keep that process the same for every single person, because when that sticky wicket comes, and they will, you want to make sure that they don't have a claim to say, but you treated me differently. And that's just ultimately going to protect you as an employer.
Becky, any of the previous executive orders that you've covered have different rules if you're above or under a certain number of employees?
So no, but what we will cover later on in today's session is there is a vaccine mandate that was just issued a year, or not a year. This is how my year's going. A week and a half ago, for over 100 employees, and we'll go over that in greater detail.
Well, one last comment, and then I'll let you advance, and I'll hold the rest of the questions to the end. We have a bunch, so if you have time, I'll hit you up with other.
Okay, that sounds great.
But one, I wanted to mention that Executive Order 14,000 about school being back in person is, when we were digital or virtual, my kids did great, and I thought this was awesome, new way of learning. They could be in separate rooms. They all have dual monitor setups. But my sister is a teacher, and she said that's not the case for a lot of kids. A lot of kids don't have internet or a computer or a room. You got 2, 3, 4, 5 brothers and sisters all in one room, one computer. You can't do virtual learning. And they don't, the rest of the world, the rest of the United States isn't all like maybe my little bubble. So it was a real shock to that, and glad to see that we're trying to find a way for in-person learning, because to your point, it really is, some kids are at a real disadvantage for virtual learning.
There was the assumption that there were resources that were equal amongst every household, and that is not the case. So whereas our children might have had the luxury of having high-speed internet and having a separate room, and that kind of thing, someone else's children, they might live in a one-bedroom apartment. They don't have all that at home. They don't have the peace and quiet and that kind of thing. So I think what this executive order did was it not only addressed that, but really the underlying is it's addressing employment too. Because I, as a mom, I'm a single mom of an 11-year-old girl, and I was very fortunate when we all got sent home that, she's of an age where she can sit quietly by herself and do her studies. But it was still hard. I'd still be in meetings, and my staff got to know my daughter very well because she didn't understand she couldn't just interrupt me. And so it's also very good for business. We do best when we can focus 100% where our feet are planted, whether it's being a parent after school hours, or whether it's being a professional during work hours. So this is really kind of one of those things that, as someone in human capital, I looked at it and thought, yes, that's good for kids, and I want it to be good for kids. But this is also really good for business because it keeps our kids learning, but it keeps them in an environment that we don't have to feel like we're so pulled back and forth as parents.
Becky, I'm going to mute myself and I'll hold the rest of the questions to the end.
All right, sounds good. All right. So I told you how inauguration was a very busy day for Biden. He must have gone to bed quite exhausted. Basically what this executive order did was it told OSHA that they had to release clear guidance for employers on COVID-19. And they did that, and they did it rather quickly. Just weeks later, they came out with 10 distinct points that they wanted all employers to consider when looking at the safety and well-being of their environment. So this is a guidance. I want you to remember that. This is not a requirement. And so look at it as just that. Now, I'm not going to read all of these for you because I think you can probably read them for yourself. But there are some really good common sense suggestions here. It may be that your organization only has to do a few of these. But if you want a greater defense, should something happen, that you acted in good faith, it behooves you and your leadership to sit down with these 10 elements from the CDC and decide what makes sense for your industry, what makes sense for your company. I can think of a local dental office here in town that when they read through this, they decided that a reverse ventilation system was a necessary thing given what they did. But they also did not choose to put their patients and their employees closer together when their patients were being worked on. Now, juxtapose that to a call center. A call center is not going to want sardines in a can anymore, right? So they may not opt for the reverse ventilation system, but they may opt to put a couple workstations between each individual. So this is just really a good thing for you to go through with your leadership. It will help you in a proactive defense should you ever be on the wrong side of things, to be able to say, listen, we took great consideration with this. We met on this, and from a reasonable person standard, you can understand why we chose the elements that we did choose to implement. So make sure that you do that, because there are a lot of state laws that are coming out with civil immunity for employers that do this. And in fact, in South Carolina, the governor there signed a bill called South Carolina COVID-19 Liability Immunity Act, and it does just that. So that keeps you from harm's way if something happens and someone turns around and sues you, keeps that liability to a minimum, if any, if you have taken proactive measures. Now, the CDC also continues to be very busy. In March, they issued an interim public health recommendation. This recommendation is only for fully vaccinated folks. So keep that in mind as we go through this. So basically what they said here is that if you are fully vaccinated, they said that you can certainly go and be in public indoor settings. But if you live in an area that has a substantial or high transmission rate, they still recommend that you mask up. Okay, remember, this is the CDC recommendations. They are not requirements. Now you can go to the CDC website and pull up their COVID-19 data tracker, and it'll show you the country and all the counties in the country. And by way of color, it'll show you whether or not it is a substantial or high transmission area. I will tell you, I pulled it up yesterday, and pretty much the entire country is red. And South Carolina in particular had no counties that were not considered either substantial or high transmission. So their recommendation is that you mask up in public indoor settings. Now, they also recommend that if you are in a lower transmission area, that you mask up if you are immunocompromised or you have some risk for a severe disease. They go on to say that if you are vaccinated and you come in contact with somebody who has COVID, they suggest that you be tested 3 to 5 days after exposure. They also suggest that you wear a mask in a public place for 14 days. Now, why is this also important to you as employers? Because these are easy guidelines to step back on and to hold on to whenever you're dealing with your employees who come to you and say, but I'm vaccinated. It doesn't matter that I came into contact with someone who has COVID. Again, you can do what you want to do. You're still running your business. The CDC is not mandating this. But it's just a nice thing to be able to say the CDC recommends this, that, or the other. So it's important for you to know as employers. Now, they also did suggest that all teachers and staff and school staff, visitors to school, mask up as well. And as you know, this has been a hot topic across the country. I've never been so fascinated by PTM meetings. Never thought I'd be watching PTM meetings from across the country. I know that I live right next to a county where the parents are very upset because they're not requiring masks. But then I've seen just the opposite elsewhere. So again, these are not requirements. These are just guidelines from the CDC as they see it. Now, they also made it clear that they feel that fully vaccinated individuals should be able to engage in pre-pandemic activities, including domestic travel, meaning that you don't have to necessarily test beforehand. You don't have to self-quarantine. Now, as far as the testing goes, the reality is because these are just guidelines, your unique airline can have their own restrictions. So your airline might be able to say you have to test, but this is not a requirement of the CDC. And then finally, they went on to say that they even would be okay with that for international travel to and from, which, you know, when someone's coming back to US soil, this matters. The reality is when we're going into another country, you know, it's their land. They can tell us what to do. So there's really no input there or impact there, I should say. So those are just some guidelines. Remember that one of the many things that we see trending with the Biden administration is equity issues. This was, you know, up in that top 3 concerns for this administration. On Inauguration Day, Biden issued an executive order that prevents workplace discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity. Now, had he just made this about employment, it would not really have been needed because a couple of years ago, the EEOC defined sex discrimination under Title VII as including this gender issues. So had it just stayed there, it would have just been, you know, probably for the media, let's be honest. But he actually expanded it to say this goes for rights of children at school. This goes for access to health care, fair housing, and many other issues of equitable living. So it did, from an employment standpoint, just reinforce what the EEOC had already determined a couple of years back. So keeping along those same lines of, there we go, those same lines of equity, there's another executive order, again, issued on Inauguration Day, that established a White House Gender Policy Council. And this was to advance gender equity. Now, we don't usually see one administration building off of a previous administration's work. This is a very unusual circumstance, but this is exactly what's happened here. So the Trump administration actually did a deep dive initiative into wage compression. And their findings are really what the Biden administration is now building off of. So in that initiative from the Trump administration, they found that white women, on average, doing the exact same job as a white man with the exact same qualifications, got paid 82 cents on the dollar. Now, I know that does not surprise the women of this group at all. Okay, we've seen it over and over again. And that's bad, but that's nothing compared to Black women who get paid 65 cents on the dollar for the exact same job with the exact same qualifications as a white man. But the worst is Hispanic women. they get paid 58 cents on the dollar. So for those of us who have girls that we're raising or granddaughters, I just want to help you put that in perspective. I mean, we're trying to give them the best education we can. We're trying to teach them to be hard workers, to be people of character, to send them out into the world and get paid possibly almost half of what their counterparts that happen to be a white male will get. The way I like to tell my staff is, I want you to imagine going to the supermarket and a white male and a Hispanic female walk in together. They're both there for a loaf of bread. They both buy the exact same loaf of bread. That Hispanic female is paying double for that exact same loaf of bread than that white male. Now, we're not saying that white males should get paid less. That's not what we're saying. They should get paid well for what they're doing, but so should anyone else who has the same qualifications and can do the same job. So, you would think at this point that's such an egregious difference, right? 58 cents to $1. I mean, that's a large difference. You'd think we would have kind of gotten there by now. So the Equal Pay Act of 1963, I mean, this was almost 60 years ago that we as a country said people should get paid the same for doing the same job. It shouldn't matter what sex they are. But here we are. Women are breaking the glass ceiling, but they're not being compensated for breaking the glass ceiling. And so that's a problem. So as CFOs, this is something that you can make a difference in. I'm asked a lot of times, well, where does really the difference makers happen? It's really the leadership of companies. It's really, something like this, it's a death by 1,000 cuts. It's one leader over here and one leader over there, all making that difference, because obviously the laws aren't, right? If we've had this law for over 60 years, the laws really aren't. So this is just a renewed effort by the Biden administration to focus on this. We're also seeing a lot of state laws come to existence that are focusing on this. Colorado is leading the way on that currently. All right, getting back to OSHA. OSHA did have an increase in their fines this year. So you just need to note that they weren't large. You can see them on your screen. Not a big deal. And I'll tell you what, OSHA, if you recall, they're pretty good about coming out. And as long as it's not something where it's a child labor violation or something that would cause death, they're pretty good about just issuing you a warning, and then only if you don't fix it would you ever get an abate violation. So they don't really hand violations out too easily, which is a good thing. But there is a reconciliation bill that's currently in the House that I want you to keep your eyes on because it contains massive increases for fines that come out of the Department of Labor. So, for instance, an FLSA violation, a Fair Labor Standards Act violation, minimum wage, overtime rule violation, something along those lines. Right now, you'd have an $1,100 fine per violation. This bill is proposing that it be a $20,740 violation. That's a huge jump. And I know that a lot of us think, oh gosh, I'm not paying anybody minimum wage or under minimum wage, but are you paying someone close to minimum wage and maybe you took their uniform expense out of their check and it dropped them below minimum wage and you just didn't pay attention? Something like that will get you a violation. So this is a great time for you and your HR team to go back and revisit everything that falls under the Department of Labor. Of course, OSHA falls under the Department of Labor as well. And the fines that they are proposing are huge. Okay, so for instance, on your screen now, you can see that right now for a willful or repeated violation, OSHA will charge you $136,532. They're proposing that go up to $700,000. So that is massive. So again, this is the time that you need to kind of have some re-energized focus on some of these laws that fall under the Department of Labor. All right, a couple days ago, a couple days after, I should say, Biden entered office, he also issued an executive order that essentially revoked executive orders issued by President Trump. And we've talked about how presidents can do that. And And essentially he was claiming that it was undermining the merit system protections of the federal civil service and hindered their collective bargaining activities. So the previous orders that Trump had issued streamlined the process for collective bargaining and the negotiations that are involved there. It also streamlined the discipline and dismissal processes for poor performing federal employees. So the order directed, the order that Biden just issued directed the head of the U.S. Office of Management and Budget to provide recommendations to the president to promote a $15 an hour minimum wage for federal employees. So again, here's that initiative. We've seen it over and over again throughout the country. You kind of have to have your head stuck in the sand not to see that we're trying to go towards a $15 minimum. We've seen lots of states go ahead and increase their minimum wage far above the federal minimum wage of $7.25. In fact, I have a little screenshot here for you. These are 31 states that have exceeded that currently exceed the federal minimum wage. And while South Carolina is not one of those, I want you to be very careful with this. In many ways, it's been a blessing for businesses that South Carolina has not increased their minimum wage. However, we are working in a very different world today. So today, you may not feel like you have to pay as much, but we're working in such a virtual world that a company out of California who has a much higher minimum wage can snag your employee, give them more than you're paying them, and still make out good in the deal. And it becomes a win-win for your employee in your state and you're in that out-of-state business. So, eventually, if the laws of South Carolina don't change, the market will demand a higher wage. That's just where we're headed. And maybe ultimately that's the best choice, right? Maybe ultimately market dictating wages is just a better thing than law dictating wages to begin with. So there's obviously been some really serious leadership changes this year. One that's significant is the head of the Department of Labor, the Secretary of Labor, former Mayor of Boston, Marty Walsh. Now, what you should know about him is he grew up in a union household. His father was a union man. You can look at his Twitter feed and he's very bold on his stance on unions, which again kind of feeds into everything that's happening with the unions right now and why I think a union resurgence is on the move. I have listened to a lot of his interviews to date since he's become the Secretary of Labor. He tends to always go back to two main issues he's working on. First and foremost, workplace health and safety, which we would expect during this time. But the other one is workforce planning. He talks a lot about investing and training our workforce. And we're seeing a lot of big companies say, hey, you don't have to go to school anymore to get letters behind your name. Come to us and we'll train you. Google is a great example of that right now. They have a huge initiative right now that people can come completely untrained and get all the training that they need to work within Google. So he seems very pro in-house training, and I think he's willing to put his money behind that. So we'll see what comes from that. Another area that we've seen some major change in is actually the National Labor Relations Board, or what we call the NLRB. This is actually a really small federal agency, but it is different than the Department of Labor. Sometimes people confuse the two, but they are very unique agencies. It was established to enforce the National Labor Relations Act. And for those of you who don't eat, sleep, and breathe employment law, and I don't know why you wouldn't, but that is exactly what we get all of our union issues from. So this is the act that protects people's right to concerted activity. It's the act that protects people to unionize. So what you need to know about this board is there's 5 members of the board. And every new administration gets 3 members to put on that board, and 2 remain from the former administration. We always see an awful lot of turnover on this board because each one has a limited 5-year term, and one is required to roll off every year. So between one rolling off every year, the occasional resignation, God forbid a death, It's not uncommon to see a vacancy, and the Senate actually has to approve any new board members. So it's not a quick process. So it's not unusual to see a vacancy from time to time. But we do have a new board, which we expect with a new administration, and they have been very clear. They've issued what their agenda is moving forward. I'm going to be very honest with you. They did not give a lot of detail. They literally just gave us this. And so I'm going to step through these with you, and we'll tell you what we think they mean by it, but we'll see what actually happens. We haven't seen a lot of significant elements coming from the board thus far. So the priorities are here. So as far as the employee handbook rules go, it's always been an issue that you cannot, in your employee handbook, state that employees cannot talk about their salary or their terms and conditions of employment. If you do that, then you're at fault for limiting concerted activity. So just keep in mind that I'm not sure where they're going with this, but if someone ever comes to you and says, hey, you're being looked at because we think you've limited concerted activity, that's one of the first things they're going to pull is your handbook. So be very careful with that. Confidentiality provisions and separation agreements, you're just going to have to be careful that you're not too grandiose. So I think they're just going to be limiting that. You might be able to say you can't tell people who our clients are. You might be able to get very specific, but anything with any ambiguity to it, like you can't discuss anything about our business, is most likely not going to be allowed. And I'm kind of running low on time, right, Robert?
Yes, I think
Okay.
if we could pause for a couple questions, that would be great.
Sure.
And then what I'll do is I'll send out the deck and your contact information for follow-up questions. But I'll hit you with 2 or 3, Becky, in no particular order. First question, there was spent a lot of time talking about the mandates. It's hot on everybody's radar. Any sample policies or resources in developing policies that include the best practices that you described if employers want to or have to create some vaccine mandates? Does your firm have any resources to share or thoughts?
Yes, we do. In fact, even non-clients can go to our COVID resource page on our website. It's at landrumhr.com, and we update that regularly as we get new information. We also typically do short webinars when something big comes out, just to give people, in layman's terms, what's going on and what they need to be doing. I'm going to forward down to this slide because this is talking about that vaccine mandate. Now, the vaccine mandate is not an executive order. So I want to make that crystal clear. I see this all over social media that I can't believe that he's, done this executive order. No, this is not an executive order. This is a directive to OSHA to give us an emergency temporary standard. So those guidelines will be coming out here in the next couple of weeks. I do not recommend you take any action until those come out. I do recommend that you start planning. What will you do? You need to continue to go over those ADA and religious exemption processes for your company. There's lots of questions, as you can imagine. An ETS is usually not too long, but I do expect this one to be lengthy. The other thing is, keep in mind, OSHA has only ever issued 10 ETSs. 5 of them have been overturned in court. I don't think the average member of the public understands that. So there is a high probability that this is challenged in court. So there's a high probability there's a short period of time that you comply while it's being while it's going through court. Very rarely have we seen a stay put on it until the court proceedings were over. So I would just really consider getting all your ducks in a row, doing a lot of research, getting ready. But we have seen in the past where sometimes these things don't come through the way that we think they will. And I would hate for your company or your employees to be subjected to something that was unnecessary. Now, if you feel like it's necessary regardless, if that's the stance your company wants to take, you certainly can go ahead and mandate those vaccinations. But you're going to have to be reasonable with those ADA and religious accommodations.
Becky, any carrots or sticks out there. You've just seen that employers are using past a mandate, past a policy. Anybody figured out the trick to getting employees to think about whether it's vaccines or wellness or diet and exercise, just trying to be healthy? Anybody crack the code on this and had some sort of program that people are interested in hearing from their employers about health and wellness?
Yeah, I will say I feel like this vaccine issue is very different than what we've seen so far up to date with wellness. So if I'm taking the vaccine issue out of this, wellness programs work very well. If you have them, you can usually get a local clinic in your area to partner with you to go maybe the first of the year, get everybody's blood pressure, their weight, that kind of thing. And then towards the end of the year, as they've had checkpoints along the way, if they reduce their blood pressure by this much, or if they reduce their weight by this percentage, they get a little bonus. Or just for them staying on the program and having that constant contact once a month with that member of the clinic, they get a little bonus. Money talks. So I'm amazed at what I have seen employees do for an extra little bit of money around Christmas time. So I see it very different. The vaccine, what we're seeing is that this has become extremely personal for people, regardless of which stance they're taking on the vaccine. And we're not really seeing the carrots helping. A lot of times what we're seeing, unfortunately, is they're only acting out of fear.
Well, Becky, this has been fantastic. And if we've learned nothing else, is that a lot is changing. There is an enormous amount that is changing. And I wrote down here a little reminder myself and share with everyone. We don't have to do this alone, right? It's a perfect time to have a quiet conversation with the resource partners that you already have, or folks like Becky. Reach out. If you don't have resources or your provider isn't at this level bringing content to you, then reach out to Becky and the rest of her team at Landrum HR. I will send out the deck and Becky's contact information for follow-up questions. And as always, if you'd please like, comment, and share my content on LinkedIn. And if you say Robert and Becky were awesome, really Robert, exclamation point, then you have a really high likelihood of getting an awesome swag bag. And Becky, thank you very much for bringing this content. I really appreciate it.
You are more than welcome. I hope you guys have an excellent day. Thank you for inviting me.
Bye-bye, everybody.